let's talk about the current Yu-Gi-Oh format approaching YCS Richmond this weekend. There is two things I want to do for this current format. The first thing is actually something we haven't done in a while, which is a little React Andy, because I saw fellow pro Yu-Gi-Oh streamer Jesse Cotton upload a video, my problems with the current Yu-Gi-Oh meta, and I haven't seen this yet, but I figured it would be a good starting point for discussing the current format. I don't actually think we've reacted to a Jesse video either. We have never done it, or it's been a while. But I am curious on what Jesse thinks of this current format. Obviously, we've talked about it with Pac a little bit in the chat. We're gonna talk about the format as a whole, and then I've prepared a little bit of a discussion leading up into YCS Richmond, where we talk about some of the meta contenders. It's not gonna be a tier list, because I feel like we've been talking about we've been doing tier lists a lot, so let's do it in a little bit of a different style. When did pro players become such crybabies? You are being incredibly toxic and not listening to what people are saying. You know, if someone says this format sucks, it is not crying if they voice it in a reasonable manner. And if someone doesn't like something, that does not make them a crybaby. Okay, like you can disagree with their opinion without insulting them. Have you ever tried that? I feel like you get you know, you'll get along better with people if you try that, you know? Like I've said multiple times that it is fair to like a diverse meta, but there's also things that are like negative about it. That one guy? No, I feel like it's important to say these things, because I think like one of the more important things in the Yu-Gi-Oh community, which I think we are lacking, is a better, what's the word for it? Like a better understanding for people with different opinions, right? Only because someone else has a different opinion than you does not mean you need to attack them as hard as possible and feel attacked by their different point of view, right? Because the freaking Yu-Gi-Oh community consists of so many different people that enjoy the game in so many different ways that it is completely reasonable for people to disagree with each other, because they simply have a different standpoint, right? I guess it is more like a general problem. It's not just the Yu-Gi-Oh community. I maybe that's just humans, but I feel like it's a very common thing that I see of like, okay, my opinion is different than yours, therefore I need to attack your opinion and invalidate your opinion, because our two opinions cannot coexist. They cannot coexist. It is not possible. Anyways, the best way to deal with it, I think, is just to be as reasonable as possible when you try to bring a point across, right? If you try to bring a point across and you just have reasonable arguments for it, I think that's the only thing you can do. Let's see if Jesse has reasonable arguments then. Let's just see what his opinion on the current. Maybe he likes the current format.
Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I want to go over a lot of the Yu-Gi-Oh discourse that's been happening on Twitter. Now, there are kind of two different topics that have been talked about, so I'm probably going to break that up into two different videos, but I figure we can get started at tackling this because, you know, on stream I've been asked quite a bit about my thoughts on this stuff, so I figure it would be good to go ahead. And before I continue, I want to address the fact that my face is poorly lit right now. Unfortunately, both the lights and both my floodlights are out. Probably
Dark
during
Jesse.
my 72-hour stream, they just got worked to death. So I'm currently in the process of replacing them.
Louder, please. I can't. He's as loud as I put it. What I can do is I can put my mic a little bit lower so you can just make the stream louder for yourself. So I am lower in comparison to Jesse now. So you just have to turn up the stream a little bit. That's all I can do. I can't make it any more, you know. So now I should be lower on your end, and you guys can just turn up the stream volume, and that should work.
But while I'm waiting for Amazon to deliver that type of stuff,
I can't do anything else.
Be patient. It'll be pretty dark, but can't stop making videos. And yeah, also go check out tsx1.com and use the code
Professional
potato10
streamer, by the way.
on all your sleeves. Fantastic is every event, and with YCS Richmond this
now
weekend.
I can't hear you. Well, you have to turn up the stream audio.
Sleeves.
That's what I said. That was part of the plan.
Let's get into the video. Okay, so the way this like kind of started out, this whole discourse is at Indianapolis, Pac had kind of a rough record. You see here.
Pac had a meltdown at the YCS. It was you know, I felt it. I felt the pain, but it was also it was a little bit funny. it was a little funny.
Here he's out at pretty much round 5. Lost to Dragon League 1-2, and then he starts complaining on Twitter. And now this is probably a little emotional. Pac's complaining because he did badly in an event. And that hurts when you put a lot of time in. You spend a lot of time practicing and you don't do well. That's going to suck. So take with a grain of salt that he's being a little dramatic, right? When we analyze this. Worst one ever played. Yep. And then he lost 1,000 different decks with people putting in random non-engine. And then someone no non-engine at all. Unplayable going second. Probably going to work behind the booth for Richmond. Yeah, so here he's just bitching entirely. I think I'm in the picture above. And this format's great. We were all out at this point. But so part of the thing is, with this, you know, we're all out thing, is this is partially only because the event was 1,900 players. So the way Yu-Gi-Oh tournaments work at a YCS is there's a different number of rounds and different amount of top cut per the amount of players that enter. And a cutoff for the next round doubles at each point. So I think 512 players, for example, you'd get the 10th round to Swiss. And then after like 1,024, you get the 10 rounds. Now, when you get all the way to 2,048, you get the 12th round, but you also get top 64, which means all the X2 should top. What does hurt though is that's 1,000 player difference doubling that. So when you get close to that, you know, barrier between the 12th round, you get a lot of X2s that don't top, like a lot. And if you check the standings, you'll see there's about 15 or 16 that don't top. So your tiebreakers have to be pretty strong to top at X2. And mine were fine for this format. Like I played it out. I went X2 at Indy and I got 35th. So I played it out from this point. I wasn't technically out, but I never could have topped.
Okay, that technically doesn't have to do anything with the format, which I guess is the point of all this. That not all the things that were particularly frustrating at YCS Indy had something to do with the current format, because it was just partially because the event number was just so awkward for the event, right? It was just so that at X2, if you had an early X2 record, you basically were already out of contention, which is not normally the case at a YCS, right? So that's just like extra frustration on top, right? I guess.
My opponents to do better.
Do you think there's a way to fix the Swiss system for like 1,950 players? There is, yeah, there is. It's being done in, I want to say, Pokemon. Sometimes, not always, but it used to be done in Pokemon. It was a system that they called X2 Top Cut. Not just more rounds. You could just play more rounds, but that's also more like just more time in the tournament. But there's a system where it's called X2 Top Cut, where you basically say before the event, every person who goes X2 or better is guaranteed in Top Cut, which would mean that sometimes you end up with awkward numbers, right? Like for example, let's say you announce X2 Top Cut, and then you have normally you would have a top 8 cut, but you have 10 people with X2 or better, right? What happens then is before you play top 8, because you have 10 people that went X2 or better, before you play top 8, you take the 9th and the 10th place finisher, who technically would miss top 8 on tiebreakers, right? The number 9 and number 10 have to play against number 7 and number 8 for a spot in top 8, right? And everyone with better records, better tiebreakers is safe in top 8, and people 7, 8, 9, 10 have to play for it, right? That is a system that they have used before in, I believe it's Pokemon. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's been a case in Pokemon at some point. And I think that would be good. I think that would be better than having people just miss on Top Cut because of a slightly worse tiebreaker, right? Like, being 32nd or 33rd, there's like such a small difference between the tiebreakers between 32nd and 33rd. I think it would be better instead of like, of course, for the person in 32nd place, they would not like it in that moment. They would be like, I wish we had the other format. But I think beforehand, before you played the event, it would feel better. Like before I enter an event with 1900 people, I would be like, so much happier to have a system like that and be like, if I make X2, I definitely have a chance at making top 32. It doesn't matter when I lose. If I go X2 in this tournament, I can play for a top 32 spot, right? I think that would be better. But it does require in total 1 extra round for the tournament, because that round, that time where the people that have to play for the top cut spots, it would be 1 extra round basically, right? Sorry to repeat, another way of doing it is that if there's 10 players in X2, you make the top 2 have a bye round 1. If the top 2 have a bye round 1, no, that doesn't work. If you have 10 people, 2 of them get a bye, then you have 8 people left. So they have 4 of them advance. Then you have 6 people. That's 3 buys. If you have 3 buys, you have 7 people that have to play, which also doesn't work. It would have to be, wait, 4 people? No, it doesn't work. It doesn't work no matter what. No, it doesn't matter. It doesn't work. What you say doesn't work. But I get what you're saying, but it doesn't really work.
So we all 3 of us were X2 at this point,
top
right?
6 gets buys.
You know, that's part of what.
Well, but if top 6 get buys, it's the same thing. Because then 7, 8, 9, 10 have to play against each other. It's the exact same thing, right? Is what I said.
Is it bad? Or make this hurt even more as it feels like you've even less agency than a normal event? So, in part, there's a good chance that the...
what if the X2 that make top are less than the X2 that don't make it? Well, then the X11s have to play because they weren't high enough in the top cut, right? Some of them.
Complaining comes from that aspect as well. At least
we don't have to talk about it. We don't have to talk about it too much. I wouldn't say it's a huge issue for Yu-Gi-Oh because it only happens every once in a while, right? It only happens if an event is specifically capped at a certain number or whatever like that. It doesn't happen super often. It's not one of the biggest problems of modern Yu-Gi-Oh. Like every once in a while, you play an event with an awkward number and, you know, it's like, okay, I guess. You know, it does suck whenever it does happen. It has happened to me before. I have gotten, I think, 35th at a YCS before with 9 and 2. I think it was YCS London. I think it was actually the one that Jesse won, the Spiral YCS. I went 9 and 2 after losing. I think I lost round 4 and 6 or something, so relatively early in day 1. And then I went 9 and 2 and I got 35th or something like that. And it really, really sucked in that moment. Like, it really sucked, especially after you go X2 early and you are on the bubble super early, which is like very, very stressful. And then you win all the rounds. You're like so happy. You're like, oh my God, I won like 5 or 6 rounds in a row to still make X2. And then the standings get posted and you're like, oh my God, dude, 35th or whatever, right? It's super frustrating. And I would like for them to fix it, but it's not like the biggest problem ever. Like I said, it's happened once to me in over, what is it now, like 12 years of playing YCS. It's happened exactly once to me, and it did suck, but it is what it is, you know?
From my perspective, and that just makes it sting harder. Like, you see, he loses round 1 in time to Vanquish Soul. That's why he's upset so much. And then loses 1 more round, and he's out. Lost round 5 to Dragon Link. Hard Draws Herald Best. Like, that's a rough tournament experience. You're out at X2 because you lost in time and you lost to Hard Draw Herald Best.
I will say, now looking at this again, the 2 losses that Pac had, I don't even know if I would say that's a format issue. Like, losing in time always sucks, regardless of the format. Like, you know, losing in time in tier format also felt bad. It's like, it's just in general an issue, right? That losing in time always feels very bad, especially if it's the first round of a YCS. It's gonna be super frustrating. And then, you know, losing to whatever deck, Hard Drawing Herald of the Abyss. Like, that's the thing, right? lost to Dragon Link 1-2 because he hard draws Herald of the Abyss in 45 cards, right? The thing is, it doesn't matter what you're playing against. You can always lose to a randomly drawn one of, even in a format that has only 1 or 2 different decks, right? And so it's like, I think discussing the current format is valid, right? I think there's valid points to be made as to why you like or dislike the current format. I just think these specific instances of this moment, I don't think it has that much to do with the current format, right?
And that's just the way it goes sometimes, right? Like, but it does suck to have put so much time and effort into something and have such a pitiful performance. So I get that. But the problems he brings up do exist, although I think it's not the worst format I've ever played. I guess that's what I want to discuss. Is I think this format's not great, but I also don't think it's like terrible. And I'm kind of explaining why I think Pac reacted the way he did, and I think it'd be a little more compassion and understanding to him rather than roasting him. But yeah, so his biggest issue is it's hard to predict what your opponent's been playing, right? There's a lot of non-engine that differs, and there's a lot of the meta that differs as well. And you know, as a pro player, we do want to prepare for events. We want to be able to, like, you know, somewhat predict our results. And when you're unable to do that, it can feel like you have no control over the game, and it cannot be fun, right? Like, we're not playing at a casino. We don't want to show up and just, you know, flip cards to the top of the deck for blackjack or reward the entire day. That's not it. And blackjack has some skill expression, but, you know, even then, like, when played properly, its win percentage is not high.
Gamba.
It's still like just above a 50-50, I believe, if you play properly. Excuse me if my knowledge in that's not great. I don't really play those games. Again, not my cup of tea. I prefer games where I feel like I have more.
Do pros like tier 0 formats more? Not generally, I would say. The thing is, I've talked about this a bunch in the past, and I think it's as simple as whether the format is diverse or the format is like a tier 0 format, it has pros and cons, right? It has pros and cons, and every format is different in that aspect, right? Because a format can, a tier 0 format can be really, really bad, and a tier 0 format can also be really, really good. For example, one positive for a tier 0 format, out from my perspective, and that's the important thing, right? This is a subjective thing that I feel when there's a tier 0 format. One advantage in tier 0 formats is that I know what to expect when I go into a YCS, and when I know what to expect, I can do things to prepare for it. And usually, as a good player, preparation, when you know what to expect, will pay off, right? When I know what to expect, I can do things, I can tech my deck, I can build my deck to respond to the format, and I will usually have a decent result because of that, right? So that is generally something that happens in tier 0 formats. Not always, because there's tier 0 formats where you can be the best player in the world and it doesn't matter, right? Like something like Goki format, for example, was a format that, yeah, even though, you know, good players still topped in Goki format, I topped Euros in Goki format, but it still felt like if I played a Goki mirror, it still really felt like reliant on the dice roll and opening specific hand traps. Like it didn't feel like it was much in my control when I played Goki mirrors at that European Championship, right? I feel like the only edge that good players had in Goki format was accepting the fact that Goki was in fact the best deck, and we didn't show up to Euros with freaking like Trickstar Sky Striker or whatever. Which, if you did that, I'm sorry, but if you chose to play Trickstar Sky Striker over Goki that format, you did not play the best deck. So, like, tier 0 formats can be good, but they can also be somewhat, you know, it depends on the tier 1 deck, basically, right? And that is one of the disadvantages of tier 0 formats, is like they 100% depend on the tier 0 deck being like a healthy interactive mirror match, because that's what in tier 0 formats you're mostly expecting to play the mirror match, obviously, right? And if the mirror match is good, then it's a good format, right? That's the thing. Like, if there's a tier 0 format, everyone plays the tier 0 deck, and the mirror match is good, why would it not be a good format? It's not very diverse. You're getting the same matchup over and over and over again, but from the sheer perspective of the gameplay, right? Like, does the better player win or whatever? It would be a good format in that regard, right? But if the tier 0 deck mirror match sucks, like the Goki mirror sucked, for example, or Frog FTK mirrors, or whatever you could think of, Danger FTK mirrors, whatever, then it would obviously not be a good format, and no one would enjoy it. Not even pro players would enjoy that kind of tier 0 format, right? And so it's like, you cannot generalize in that fashion and about tier 0 formats. And I think the same also works for diverse formats. I think diverse formats, they can be very good from a competitive standpoint, but they can also be kind of overwhelming, especially if decks work too differently. And this is the thing where, once again, I'm not stating this as a fact, which is very important, so people don't come at me with the pitchforks. I'm not stating this as a fact. I'm just stating this as my perspective, my opinion about diverse formats when I'm trying to prepare for a YCS. And I do kind of feel that right now, when in my head, I'm already thinking about what do I want to play for YCS Bologna and so on and so forth. My perspective on super diverse formats like the one we have right now is that it can be rather overwhelming to prepare for an event, because it feels like there's too many different things to prepare for, and it's impossible to make a correct decision, right? Because that's what we want to do when we prepare for an event. We want to analyze the format, and we want to find a quote-unquote good solution to the format that gives us a good chance. We don't feel entitled to do well. That's the one thing that I want to say. I do not feel entitled to ever do well at a tournament. I always feel like I need to work for it, right? I want to put in effort, but I do want to see some results if I put in a lot of work, right? Because I know that if I put in a lot of work, I can perform well at events, right? And so the frustrating part is not that people feel entitled to do well, but it's when they put in a lot of effort and then they don't get anything out of it because the format was quote-unquote unsolvable anyways from the beginning, is like frustrating, right? It's like when I look at this current format and I see, like, we're going to talk about it in a bit. We're going to talk about all the different decks that you need to be prepared for. And then it just feels very arbitrary, right? When you go to an event and you're like, okay, there's 20 different decks that are all really good right now. And then, you know, half of them play a lot of hand traps, half of them play a lot of board breakers, some of them play shifter, some of them are Tearlaments, some of them make dweller, some of them are like rescue ace set for back row, some of them, you know, all that kind of stuff, right? A lot of these decks, because it's Yu-Gi-Oh, are gonna work in very, very different ways, right? And preparing for decks that work very differently is tough. It's not impossible, right? You're still gonna be you still are gonna be somewhat prepared. So the format right now is not awful, right? I don't think the format is awful because and that is also, I think, very very good to note about the current format, is that a lot of the decks that are good right now are not that, like, degenerate. Like, there's not many decks right now that I have a concrete problem with. Like, I don't think Rescue Ace is a super problematic deck design. I don't think Unchained is super problematic deck design. I don't think I like a lot of the decks in the format right now are like, I'm fine with those decks. You know, I like those decks. I think they're all right. Pearly is a little bit arguable because Noir is kind of a cringe card design. I will admit that. I think Pearly as a deck overall, I think, is okay. The only thing I don't like is the Noir kind of being the boss monster. Like, I'm not a big fan of towers, but like you know, like Pearly still is somewhat balanced overall. Most of the individual decks I'm fine with, right? Not every single deck I like, but most of the decks right now in the format I'm okay with them existing. It's just the fact that they all exist at the same time can be overwhelming. And one take that I hear super often is just like, oh, the pro players are just crying because they don't know how to play against Rogue. That is not true. I would never complain about losing to a Rogue deck if I lost because I don't know the cards. That's on me. that is 100% on me. If I lose to a rogue deck because I don't know what their cards do, you would never see me complain about that. Unless it's Loci. No, even Loci, I have never lost to Rika because I don't know what the cards do. I have never lost to Rika because I made a misplay based on what kind of like cards they had. I've lost to Rika because I've lost the dice roll and gotten full comboed on, and that was my issue with the deck. My issue with it is not that it's a viable rogue deck. That is not my issue. Right? I have lost to Rika before, but not because I didn't know the cards. I lost to Rika because literally there was no game being played. I lost to Rika in Top Cut at German Nationals because they went first, full comboed me game 1 and game 3, and had roll game 1 and game 3 on top. Like, that is not... that is not a, oh, you didn't know the Rika cards angle, you know? Either way. Yeah, and that is the thing, right? The thing is, diversity from a pro player perspective is just hard to prepare for. And when I say hard to prepare for, I don't mean like, oh, you just need to work harder. Because hard implies you can do it by just doing more work or preparing better, right? It doesn't feel like that. It doesn't feel like the more you prepare, the better you will perform. Which is, that's what we want, basically. We want all the work we put into a tournament to get us something if we do all that work, right? But it doesn't even feel hard to prepare for it. Sometimes it feels impossible, and that's the frustrating thing, I think. That's a better way to put it. It doesn't feel hard to prepare for, because that's fine. We are willing to work hard, but it does feel impossible sometimes, because if there's so many different decks, you literally don't have the option. You cannot make your deck good against everything, right? It's not possible. It's not something you can do. Because if there was a deck that could beat everything, then we wouldn't be talking about a super diverse format. If there was a way to build Rescue Ace to beat everything in the format, we'd have a tier 0 Rescue Ace format. If there was a way to make Unchained a tier 0 deck to beat everything, we wouldn't be talking about a super diverse format right now, right? Just accept it. I mean, I am accepting it. I'm just discussing the format right now, if you will allow it, right? Like, I'm not saying, like, I'm quitting Yu-Gi-Oh! If it stays like that, you know, because I do acknowledge that diverse formats have their advantages as well, right? Because, and that is one thing I also realized over time, the people complaining in situations like this one, or rather, I wouldn't even call it complaining what I'm doing right now. I'm just explaining my point of view. I'm not even saying it's a inherently bad thing and it shouldn't be like that, because I don't think that's the way. Because the people that this impacts, right? The quote unquote, as you guys want to call it, pro players, right? That have issues with super diverse formats, they are the absolute minority here. Right? We are the absolute minority when it comes to these type of things, because the majority of the Yu-Gi-Oh player base just enjoys diversity, right? The overwhelming majority enjoys having options when it comes to deck choice, enjoys watching different decks on stream when it comes to like, you know, YCS coverage and so on and so forth, right? And in that sense, I think it's completely okay for the format to be diverse, right? I think it's just there needs to be a balance between the two things, but overall I think diverse formats are great for the game, right? Even if I personally I didn't perform well at YCS Dortmund, which I don't think was an issue because of diversity. I think it was because I didn't prepare well enough. But even if I'm not going to perform well at YCS Bologna, maybe it's going to be because the format is too diverse, and I can't find a good deck that beats enough different decks, and then I get the wrong matchups. Maybe that's gonna happen. That's part of being a Yu-Gi-Oh player. You know, some formats that's gonna happen. That's okay. You know, I'm not gonna like it. I'm not gonna like the fact that maybe I don't do well at YCS Bologna if it happens, right? I'm not, you know, who knows? But if it happens, then so be it, right? It's like, it's gonna be I think it's a good format for the game in general, because a majority of the community are enjoying it, and it also tends to be one of the situations where people are more inclined to start playing Yu-Gi-Oh! From the, like, if from the outside, it doesn't look like there's like only one deck, right? It does attract new players, so on and so forth. You know, a majority of the community likes it, which is why overall I'm cool with diverse formats. I'm cool with diverse formats. I don't feel entitled for the Konami company to make every single decision to make me happy, me specifically, right? They don't need to do that. It's not their job to keep me as a quote-unquote professional Yu-Gi-Oh player happy with every single format. You know, it's completely okay if the format is very diverse, and then, you know, okay, maybe it's impossible to really prepare for the YCS, but, you know, so be it, right? There's going to be another YCS after. There's going to be another format after this one. If the format right now isn't completely god awful, right? So it's like I'm not super mad about it. I'm probably going to find a deck for YCS Bologna that I'm going to be okay with playing, you know, and even in diverse formats, there's still a lot of skill expression in Yu-Gi-Oh, right? That's the thing. Like the bottom line, the bottom, there's always a minimum of skill in Yu-Gi-Oh, right? There's always a minimum level of skill when it comes to playing and preparing for Yu-Gi-Oh events, and so I think it's overall just okay, right? Okay, that was way more me ranting than actually listening to Jesse. Let's listen to Jesse a little bit.
And you lose that when you have no ability to prep, right? You lose a lot of that. That doesn't mean it's entirely gone, but yeah.
Also, it's not like there was no good choice for YCS Indie. Rescue Ace was the better choice, as it was 35% of Top Cut. Not perfect, but definitely the best. I would tend to agree with you for YCS Indie. Yeah, I was very surprised by Rescue Ace's performance. Partially because I'm gonna be honest with you, because I have not had any big events in quite a while. I did not play Age of Overlord format yet much. I didn't test for like I didn't really test for YCS Indie because I didn't attend it, right? And so maybe I would have just found out that Rescue Ace was like the best by far, but that's also partially the reason why I haven't done a tier list for the format yet, because I simply don't feel like I'm in the position to do it, because I haven't put in the time and effort yet to learn the format enough. I've just been watching. It would just be me from a completely observing position. What do I think of the format, right? Which is something we're going to do today. We're just not going to do it in a tier list fashion.
But the thing is, though, like when you look at the Top Cut results, it's not actually that diverse,
yeah,
which is interesting. I mean, in Swiss, at least from my perspective, and others as well, there was a lot of other non-race decks that we played against. Like when we played 2 race in Swiss. But this is, you know, a somewhat normal format. It doesn't feel that crazy.
Yeah.
There's not an insane amount of decks here. So while the format is diverse, I don't think it's actually true that it's like too diverse to the point where it's, you know, super ass. And he was referencing the time period of like post-COVID and before POT that was kind of toxic.
I would argue that the quote-unquote perfect format is simply somewhere in the middle between like a tier 1/tier 0 format and a super diverse format, right? I think it's just somewhere in the middle is just fine. I don't know the exact number of decks, but like don't make it so people feel like they only have one option, but also don't make people overwhelmed with like 30 options. You know, something in the middle, somewhere. You know, somewhere in the middle is what I would say.
As a reference point to why the format wasn't good.
I feel like everyone has their own opinion on that, and that's completely fine, right? But that opinion doesn't get the people going. But that's the thing. That's not what I want. I don't want to get the people going. I don't want people to bring out the pitchforks every time someone voices an opinion. I think that is not very good discussion culture. So we're not going to do that.
Others hated that format, in part due to its diversity, and I think that was way more diverse than this, right? Like we look at the lists, and there's a lot of lists that look the same, and you know there are some differences, right? So you can see there's like Valor, Ash, Econ, Imperm in this deck, whereas Ash, Imperm's probably talents in this deck. But like, okay, we can't expect everyone to be playing carbon copies of the same deck, and I really don't feel like this is anything too crazy. Like, yeah, there's some differences, but most decks you do want to have prepared for board breakers and hand traps. That's just good deck building either way. And if you aren't prepared for one, then you should expect that other method to start popping up a lot more, because it'll have a clear weak spot in the format. So I find it like strange, or that people have this kind of thought. Like, don't get me wrong, I don't love this format, but the diversity, while is not as diverse as the tier 0 format, which I tend to enjoy, it's fine.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it does just come to him having a bad run and the X2 knocking him out that led to pack being so dramatic, and that somehow spiraled into this whole discussion about the state of the format. But I think there is actually one issue with this format that is like that other format that I don't like, the WCQ format from 2022. This is like one of the only like true rogue decks.
That format, by the way, Nationals last year, by the way, I think is an example of a diverse format that I really didn't enjoy. Like, this format being diverse or somewhat diverse, I'm way more okay with. Last year, I didn't enjoy, but that was not mainly because there was too many decks, but also because a lot of decks just did super stupid stuff, right? It was Adventure, Scythe, Turbo decks, dude. Flu was running rampant. Sword Soul was like the mid-range deck, but in reality, Sword Soul just drew a bunch of cards on first turn to like anti-spell you or de-barrier you after siding every single time, man, and they always had it. It was like, there was freaking 15 different decks, but it was just 15 different flavors of locking your opponent out of playing, right? Mystic Mine was there, Scythe was there, de-barrier, anti-spell. Like, that's why I didn't like that format, right? Like, adventure cards making you play through hand traps like it's nothing, all that kind of stuff, right? And so it's like, that format wasn't necessarily bad because it was diverse. Like, yes, it was bad, and yes, it was diverse, but it wasn't bad because it was diverse. It was bad because 15 different decks, but they all did toxic things, right?
In here, rogue decks always top. There's nothing like that obscene about it. We had tier topping cash format somehow. Like, that's not that crazy. Part of what I don't like, though, is let's look at a deck like the deck that Paulie Aronson played to win the Morimoto ICS around this time.
Yeah,
around the time that I'm talking about.
Dude, look at this.
It was bad. Now, there's a lot of one-ofs in this deck. And now, the reason we play one-ofs in general is typically because we don't want to draw the card, but it's an engine requirement for, whatever reason.
Okay,
so it's alarming.
I am wondering what what he is concerned about with the current meta. Is it that he doesn't like the fact? Okay, no, I get that. I think I know where he's going. I think I know where he's going. Where let me try and make you type pre-watched into the chat, because I haven't pre-watched it, but let me try to predict what he's trying to say. Because I think the point is that decks that play random one-of engine requirements that you don't want to draw, but you want them in your deck for certain options, right? That can make a format slightly worse because it's a lot of variance. It's a lot of variance because drawing the cards that you have to put in your deck, but you don't want to draw them, can be very, very frustrating and has nothing to do with how good you are, right? Like, if you're playing an Unchained deck right now, as an example, Unchained as a deck has multiple cards in it that you do not want to draw, like the DDD Vice King Requiem, the Unchained Soul of Chiyama, the Fiendish Rhino Warrior, the Abominable level 8 main deck monster, the Blue Dog, which some of them play, so on and so forth, right? Those kind of cards are, I would say, I don't think they are great game design, because having those cards in your deck makes it's just a whole lot of variance, right? It's just a whole lot of variance, because even if you're the best Unchained player in the room, if you draw too many of those cards throughout your tournament run, it's gonna suck, right? You're gonna be at a disadvantage just because you have those cards in your hand, which is random at the end of the day. There's no way to prevent it. It goes against it goes against all the principles of deck building, right? Because normally what we do when we build decks is we put cards in there that we want to draw. That's the idea of building a Yu-Gi-Oh deck, right? You put the cards in there that are good to draw, right? That's the point of building a deck, right? And normally we try to avoid having to put those cards in it, right? There was a time in Yu-Gi-Oh, believe it or not, there was a time in Yu-Gi-Oh where we didn't really do that, where we never really put cards into the deck that we didn't want to draw. There was only very, very few exceptions back in the day of playing cards that we didn't want to draw. One of the first things that came to my mind right now was Gen X Undyne and Gen X Controller in early Mermail. That's something I remembered. Garnet was the original, you know, the Brilliant Fusion Garnet was the that was the invention of the term Garnet, right? Psyframe Driver was like one of the first like mainstream ones that went into a bunch of like Titanial is a good example, right? Mystical Shine Ball, those kind of things, right? Wolf. There's a couple examples of this, and I think we can all relate. If we've been playing Yu-Gi-Oh for a couple years, we can all relate that it does kind of suck being forced to play those kind of cards, right? It doesn't feel great playing a Wolf in your deck. You know, sometimes it feels great, but usually it's very high variance, right? Sometimes it feels really good, sometimes it feels really bad, right? It's high variance, right? And if there's a lot of decks in the format that do that, it can sometimes be frustrating because it creates things like, oh, I'm playing against these decks and they never draw these one-ofs, right? And I draw them all the time, and it creates these kind of frustrating experiences sometimes, right? Currently, there is a couple of decks with that problem, right? Like I mentioned, Unchained has that issue. Unchained definitely has that problem. For another example is Rescue Ace. Rescue Ace has that problem where you have all those one-off targets for Turbulence that, you know, it's sometimes okay to draw them, but you would rather not, so on and so forth, right?
I number one of the deck because I mean the deck is, in order to maintain a high power level, it's playing a lot of cards you don't want to draw. And in small doses, that can be okay because it can create some interesting game states where you're forced to play differently. It also create a lot of hands where your hands feel incredibly ass.
Yep.
And you just can't do anything. And that's really what I dislike,
okay,
right?
Don't say
like
pre-watched. I haven't pre-watched it. I swear I haven't pre-watched it. But I very often I do feel like Jesse and I do think alike on a lot of things game design wise.
You can go for a consistency route. The deck that has no hand traps. I mean, sorry, the deck that has no like the one-ofs. I don't know why I said hand traps. Like this Purely deck here. Very limited. But your deck can just be...
I even talked about this before. I talked about this in my Rescue Ace, in my Purely deck profile. I think that was the reason why I played Purely over Unchained. Because it didn't have those cards. That is why I played Purely at the YCS over Unchained. That was the one reason, because I liked both decks. That was why I played Purely over Unchained.
Weaker most of the time, right? And that's the problem, unless they draw those, you know, one-ofs. And I think we're seeing that happen here with a lot of the decks as well. And like we look at the race deck, look at the number of one-ofs in here, right? There's Diabellstar. He played 3 Impulse, but a lot of people just played 1. The 1 Fire Engine. You got the Sinful Spoils here. The 1 Diabellstar. You get the Rescue, Alert, HQ.
The Diabellstar is a bad example. I disagree with Diabellstar somewhat. Because the cool thing about the that's why I've also talked about this in the past. That is why I like the design on the Diabellstar package so much, because out of the Diabellstar engine, you play 3-1-1. That's the standard ratio because you obviously want to draw the quick play spell. That's the best one. But the cool thing about it is that drawing one of the other two still works. They are not bricks. And this is why this is such great card design, is because you have those engine requirements, Diabellstar and the Sinful Spoils normal spell in your deck, but they are not garnets, right? That is great card design, as opposed to designing something like Gamma and Driver together, which I think is just awful card design, right? This is something that I wish they would do this more often. I hope they do this more often in the future, where they design engines like this without completely dead engine requirements, right? That is something I hate when they do that. because yes, they are weaker, right? The quick play spell is better to draw than Diabellstar, or better to draw than the normal spell, but the other two, they still work, and that's, I think, super crucial and super nice card design on this engine in particular.
Rhoda's add 1, that doesn't matter, and then the 2 traps here. And while this isn't like as alarming as the other one, there's a lot of one-ofs in here that you don't really want to draw. And while some of them are okay, they just make your hand a bit less powerful, like these. Some of these can kind of suck, man, especially when you're going second. And what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to cut these traps? Like, going second, you take out some of these traps. Sometimes you have to, but like, the issue is you open yourself up to just being a weaker deck than your opponents, right? Yep. If your opponent's playing the greedier list and they just draw none of the one-ofs, their deck is just inherently better than yours if you start trimming the fat. And when people play greedy like this and then they go greedier and greedier, it gets into a format that's not very interesting, right? Because you'll play with your hand that kind of sucks versus their hand that's incredible, and you'll lose because you have to build a deck very greedily, or you'll build your deck to be consistent.
It's what it boils down to. It's just high variance. The more of those cards you are forced to play, it's higher variance.
And that can be rather, frustrating. Now, I'm not saying this deck is a greedy deck. There were more things you could have done to make it greedier. But there are still one-ofs that when I've tested this deck, I've drawn my hands and be like, God damn, this sucks. Because of these one-ofs.
And this was also way back when we saw Rescue Ace for the very first time. I said this already. Like, yes, setting 4 with Turbulence is very powerful, but I don't like the fact that I need to build a deck with so many random one-ofs that I probably don't want to draw in it. Right? I said that the first time I read Turbulence.
Issue is this deck's not alone, and that's the problem, right? Like,
luck is part of the game, always has been and always will be. Yeah, I'm not saying they should remove luck completely from the game, but variance can be frustrating is the only point. Like, I'm not saying like we're not playing chess, right? We're not playing chess to the point where the better player should always win, right? But it still does feel kind of nice for everyone when you can put in some amount of work into the game and get some amount of reward, right? It's not chess, but it's also not straight up gambling, right? So we need to I think we can agree on the fact that we need to be somewhere in the middle, right? Somewhere.
If we go down to another deck that's been popular, and not those decks that were rather rogue, at least they seem to be, like Tier. Look at these goddamn one-ofs, right? Like, this is...
I mean, okay. Tier has a lot of one-ofs because of the ban list. That is not something that has anything to do with, like, Merly, Havness, Sharon, they're not engine requirements, right? They're not like Garnet that you need in your deck to resolve a different card or whatever.
Asked to draw, use Pathway 2. This is bad, it's not great, this is not good. And you got more cards you don't want to draw, Like,
it does have some.
Tier has a lot of these hands as well, where you'd open up and be like, wow.
Privy Karma is a prime example, because Tier has like a lot of ways to get rid of cards in their hand. Like, even if you draw a Mali, even if you draw a Denier, even if you draw like a Destrudo or a Shiyama, you have ways to discard them at least, which can be a good way to balance these kind of card designs. Like, if you're playing a deck that can discard cards easily, then you can make those decisions and it's less of a risk. Like, for example, if you're playing Furniture Labyrinth, it's not as bad to have a dead driver in your hand, which is why Gamma is a lot better in Furniture Lab than in other decks, for example, or in Pearly, where you have a lot of discards. The Tearlament deck has a lot of ways to get these cards out of their hand, but you need to see them in the first place, and you have way less ways to pitch a Privy Karma than a Destrudo, for example, right? The only thing you can do if you draw a Privy Karma is you can pitch it for Super Poly, or you have to like set it and pop it with your own Pearl Rhino, something like that. Very, very awkward.
My hand loses to an Ash. You have some hands that feel like they're invincible, which is incredible. That's why Tier feels good sometimes. But there are many hands that just can't do that. And that's just so off-putting. Like, that's part of why I just can't play this deck.
I mean, this also... He's summarizing why none of these decks is also just straight up the best deck in the format, right? Like, if you could play Tearlaments without those random brick hands or whatever, the deck would be phenomenal. If you could play Rescue Ace, and you didn't have that problem of drawing the one-ofs, that's the one thing that really balances out Rescue Ace, right? Is like that they have awkward hands like this, right? And so from an overall win rate perspective, these kind of things balance out the format right now. This is why we have so many options, because there is no deck that feels like super satisfying to play, because the decks are either like every deck has its own set of issues, right? Every deck has it. Some decks have too many bricks in it. Some decks lose to certain other decks just too hard. Some decks lose in time, Troll Despair, so on and so forth, right? There's like no deck.
But it's not
we
alone.
wouldn't have such a diverse format if there was a miracle
deck
solution.
that I've been playing. And while I feel like it can be consistent, you still have problems. There's not an Unchained deck list here. There's not an Unchained deck list here. All right, I'll go get that 1 second. Okay, so here's, you know, a somewhat standard Unchained deck.
Yeah.
And there's a good number of one-ins in here, right? You got this card you don't want to draw, this card you don't want to draw, this card you don't want to draw, this card you don't really want to draw, this card you don't want to draw, this card you don't want to draw.
Yeah, it's off. This
like,
is literally, I love Unchained as a deck. I love Unchained as a deck, but this is the single reason why I didn't want to use it. Because I know when I enter a YCS with Unchained, frame one, I'm going to open Vice King Requiem. Literally, round 1, game 1, first card I draw is Requiem.
That adds up. And that leads to some hands you'll lose with this deck because you do like Vice King Abominable Soul and you're like, ha, my hand sucks. Those aren't good. So I think it's almost a bit of like a you know, a false herring that people are saying the format's too diverse. While it's a little more diverse than, you know, my preferences, it's I think healthy type of diverse right now. I think part of what I dislike is the power level of the decks is high, but it's a high dependent on playing a bunch of one-of cards in your deck that really like make games, you know, not fun. And that kind of sucks like a lot. That's like,
it does not feel good to lose a game because you drew that random one-of in your deck that you really didn't want to draw, but you don't, it doesn't feel like you have the option to cut it. For example, from the perspective of when I tested Unchained, for example, it didn't feel like you had the option of cutting the Contract and Vice King Requiem, because it just does so much in your deck, right? The deck is so weak without the Contract card. Like it's honestly not even a discussion at this point anymore whether you should play those cards or not. Those cards are extender, starter, follow-up, because you can search it off of your rank 6 Caesar XYZ. They are even a freaking searchable time win condition. You cannot cut those cards from the deck. It is not possible, right? They help you break boards. They destroy your opponent's cards. They do everything. It's not really an option. You have to take the risk, right? You have to take the risk. And it does sometimes, you know, taking a risk is fine, right? Taking a risk is fine, but when you're being forced to take a risk because it's just way too powerful, right? The card is way too powerful, so you're forced to take the risk. And then you draw the Vice King, you're like, God damn it, why was I forced to take this risk? It's like a format where compare it to a situation where you're playing a format where some decks are so powerful at going first that you need to play hand traps like Gamma and Nibiru in your main deck. If you're forced to play cards like Gamma and Nibiru in your main deck, you're like, okay, I'll play it, right? I'll play them. But then you play against decks where Nibiru is completely dead, and you're like, damn it, why was I forced to put this card into my deck? It's like Max C and Master Duel, and then you queue into Flunder. Do you see where I'm coming from? Do you see where that's frustrating? You're sitting there. The decision to put Max C into your deck was completely reasonable. You didn't make a mistake in deck building. You should have put Max C in your deck, right? That was something you were absolutely right when you put Max C into your deck. But then you play against Flunder and Max C in your hand is just completely dead. And that's frustrating. That's a frustrating moment, right? Literally yesterday we drew triple Max C against Flu. Did I have fun that game? No, I didn't. No, I didn't.
My actual real issue. And like, so some other decks you can play that are not like that is Purely. And it's like playing Sword Soul in that format. But I feel like, you know, as I tested either of these decks, if your opponent draws,
okay, well,
and they're playing a greedy deck and they draw like the 5 of their good cards or 6 of their good cards and none of the one-ofs, you are just playing a weaker deck than your opponents. I stand by that fact, and you know that one's a little more subjective. Yes, I can't really call it fact. I stand by that opinion. But when I've played Sword Soul or Purely, the deck doesn't feel as strong as these other decks.
That's the thing, right? If Pearly was just straight up stronger than other decks, there would be no reason to play Unchained, right? There would be no reason to have a deck with all those bricks in your deck if you can just play Pearly, not have bricks in your deck, and have a stronger deck, right? It's a payoff of, it's an eternal payoff of consistency versus power, and it can feel somewhat frustrating when you feel like you're forced to play the bricks to make your deck more powerful, and then you draw the bricks. I think that's a frustrating moment sometimes.
And I think, you know, it's still, even though it's not like a really displaying the one of thing that I'm showing about, it still kind of is a victim of it, where it is, I think, just weaker. It Purely has other issues, and I think it's part of why Pack also lost. You know, that's I don't think Purely is that great of a choice, partially because it struggles to deal with board breakers, and he's saying he played around it, but like, I don't know how. Like, he played around Encore, but he had Herald the Abyss. Then he needed Beauty up, but like, Beauty isn't really enough to win, so I don't know how much that's playing around it. It's like playing around it, but you know, if they have playable hands still, they beat Imperm, they're gonna beat you still. But yeah, I digress. I mean, the interesting case out of this is Vanadium. It has less brick one-ofs, because these one-ofs, you know, are fine. They're kind of just thrust one-ofs. This is like the worst ones, and these are like not that bad. I guess Gyrocash is probably the worst one. And you know, I haven't really played this deck that much, and part of why I've been intrigued to try it more, partially is Triff just you know running his mouth, and sometimes it can be misleading what's good, because he just hypes up a deck too much. But because
well, even Jesse gets caught by it, dude. Even Jesse, where have we come? Oh my god, even Jesse gets caught in the Triff hype. Oh god.
So that doesn't have you have those glaring one of hands that'll make you want to scream because your hand just sucks. And the two ofs in here, while aren't great, are still a lot more manageable, right? Visas and Arrival. And yeah, that's part of why I kind of want to try this type of deck out, is it feels like it has less of those one.
So what it boils down to, I think, or my opinion on this matter, is I don't think this is something that completely invalidates a format, right? When there's decks that play engine requirements, one-offs, bricks, whatever, it's not something that makes the game bad per se, right? But I can just say from my perspective, I feel like it's nice to have options of decks that don't do that, right? If I have the option between a deck that has to play bricks in it and a deck that doesn't have to play bricks in it, I will always pick the deck that doesn't have bricks, because I just don't like the experience of drawing bricky hands. That is something I want to avoid, right? It's something that I want to avoid at all costs if I can. And when there's too many decks in the format that all have to play bricks, and I don't have the option to go with a consistent deck, I don't feel great about that, right? That's I think what it boils down to.
So maybe this format's salvageable, like we're just at the beginning, and you know,
does the Mechanical Sinful Spoil have bricks? Probably. Like, I don't think you want to draw the Renaud and stuff like that, even though it's not that bad. Some of the equip spells.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of where I'm standing right now, and why I'm having a hard time. Now, I really don't think the format is terrible. I do want to make that apparent. I don't love the format. I don't think it's anything I particularly will remember super fondly, but it's not something I'm going to detest greatly, like that Adventure Synchro format.
Yeah.
It doesn't have as many gross one-ofs in your deck. You're not playing goddamn Draco back in this deck. And you're also not so diverse. You can play against Marincess versus Adventure versus Swordsoul versus Despia. It all plays so drastically and differently that it's impossible to prepare for. It's not that bad. I think it is a bit more watered down of that format, where the one-of thing isn't as bad but still bad, and the diverse thing is not nearly as bad, but you know, it still exists. And it can make it a bit hard to prepare for a tournament, but I think that also compounded with the 1900 man event knocking out X2s immediately. That you know, kind of started this whole debacle. So yeah, going forward, I'm not sure how the format will play out. Obviously, we got 2 events announced so far that formats will be played under, and we'll see, you know, Bologna and Richmond how they go. It should probably be diverse still, but one thing probably isn't going to change anytime soon until the new deck comes out. You know, that's what I liked about tier, is, you know, as a tier 0, but also you didn't have a lot of these, you know, agreed.
I think giving most future decks powerful discard 1 could easily fix this while still keeping some variance. I would tend to agree with that. I like it when decks have... There's just certain things in card design that I think are good for the game. Like, for example, when decks have something in it to discard cards from their hand for some value, right? I would agree with that. If you have a card in your engine that requires you to discard and gets you some value for it, that always makes it so you have the option to unbrick some of the cards in your hand, right? That is something that is a healthy design. As well as, I think, super healthy design. Like, we've been asking for them to ban certain floodgates forever now, but it's not going to happen. Which is why I also think something like generic in-engine outs to just, like, destroy a face-up card on the board or something is also something super, super healthy, right? I think it's super healthy to give cards, archetypes, a card that destroys cards on the board, just to have a chance against the floodgate, for example, right? If you're not main decking something like Feather Duster, which is most of the time not correct in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! To play back row removal specifically. So like cards like, what is recent examples of back row removal? Like, I mean, Sword Soul Blackout, cards like the Virtual World Continuous Trap. Those kind of things are, like, I think good game design most of the time. Heartbeat was okay. Salamangreat Rage. Those kind of things I always like. None of those cards that I just mentioned are super, super powerful, but they're, like, good to have in the game, right? Sprite Smashers. Like, none of them are problem cards. Branded Beast. Nothing is a problem, but they're all pretty good, like, card design, I think.
Just one of just sitting in your deck, you all consistent.
Escape of the Unchained. All that kind of thing. Revishuda, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's...
yeah, that's it. I mean, I agree with most of this. I think we've talked about this more than enough. I think I made my opinion clear. I hope that brought I hope that made it a little bit more clear what I think about the current format and diverse and tier 0 formats in general. I think it was an interesting discussion, and I feel like we had a good and respectful discussion going on. And that's, I think, the main point is, like, you should try to understand different people's perspectives, because we don't always play the game in the exact same ways.